Hey, welcome to Notebook Summaries. Today, we're jumping into the incredible story of Peru, a history that goes back thousands and thousands of years. Okay, let's dive right in. To really get a handle on Peru, it helps not to think of its history as just a straight timeline. It's more like layers, the layers of a nation. Each new era, from these ancient cultures to the modern republic, was built right on top of the one before it, creating the complex, amazing country we see today. So we're going to peel back 6 of those distinct layers, starting with the very first cradles of civilization, moving to the massive Inca Empire, then the Spanish conquest, the birth of the Republic, a really tough century of turmoil, and finally, where Peru is headed today. All right, so our first layer takes us way, way back. Long before the Incas ever came on the scene, this region was buzzing with diverse and really sophisticated cultures that laid the foundation for everything to come. This timeline really puts into perspective just how deep Peru's history runs. We're talking about a continuous story that spans millennia, from the very first hunters living in caves to the shift to farming, and then, this is incredible, the city of Caral. It's the oldest city in all of the Americas, and it was built around the same time as the Great Pyramids in Egypt. Just think about that for a second. And what's so wild is the sheer variety and achievement here. These cultures weren't just a warm-up act for the Incas, not at all. The Norte Chico, for example, they were one of only 6 places on the entire planet where civilization just popped up independently. Then you have the Nazca with those mysterious lines in the desert, the Moche with their stunningly realistic pottery, and the Wari and Tiwanaku who built the first great empires in the Andes. And that brings us to our next big layer. This is where we see how one of those Andean tribes, a group from a city called Cusco, managed to build the largest and most advanced empire in the Americas before Columbus. And they did it in a remarkably short amount of time. The empire they built was called Tawantinsuyo, which in their language means the 4 united regions. And that name alone tells you so much about their genius for organization. Everything revolved around the capital, Cusco, and was held together by an absolute masterpiece of engineering, a huge network of roads. So how on earth did they run such a massive empire? Well, they built it on these key pillars. You had a divine ruler, the Sapa Inca, who was seen as a god on earth. The economy was based on collective ownership, so everybody owed labor to the state. Quechua became the official language that tied everyone together, and that incredible road system with its super-fast relay messengers called chasquis, well, it let them control a huge, rugged territory stretching all the way from modern-day Colombia down to Chile. And of course, the Incas left us wonders like Machu Picchu. It was brought to the world's attention in 1911 by Hiram Bingham, a guy who's often said to be the real-life inspiration for Indiana Jones, which is a great story. But it's also really important to remember that local people always knew it was there. For them, it was never really lost. Okay, so now we come to a really dramatic and frankly, a pretty traumatic layer in Peru's history, the arrival of the Spanish conquistadors. This was a true collision of worlds, and it led to the shockingly fast collapse of the mighty Inca Empire. The whole thing really pivoted on one event, the Battle of Cajamarca. On one side, you have Francisco Pizarro with just 168 men. On the other, the Inca ruler Atahalwa, surrounded by thousands of his soldiers. So how did this happen? Well, the Incas were in a terrible spot. They had just been devastated by a smallpox epidemic and were at the tail end of a brutal civil war. Pizarro exploited this perfectly, launching a surprise attack that captured the emperor and sent the entire empire into a tailspin. The human cost of this conquest was just catastrophic. In a single century, the indigenous population plummeted from an estimated 9 million down to just 600,000. And while the violence was a factor, the overwhelming killer was invisible. The peoples of the Americans had zero immunity to European diseases like smallpox. And here you see a perfect example of that layers theme we've been talking about. The Spanish built their new colonial empire literally right on top of the Inca one. They set up their capital in Lima, and they took the Inca labor system, the mita, and twisted it to force indigenous people to work in the silver mines. Peru basically became the cash cow for Spain's empire, but all that exploitation eventually lit the fuse for major rebellions, like the huge uprising led by Tupac Amaru II. That desire for freedom just kept growing, which leads us into our next layer, the long, difficult fight to break away from 300 years of Spanish rule and create a new, independent nation. These are the famous words spoken by José de San Martín when he declared Peru's independence back in 1821. But here's the thing, that declaration was really just the beginning. The Spanish forces were still very powerful, and it took another 3 years of really tough fighting with help from Simón Bolívar's armies to finally secure that victory. But as we'll see, winning independence didn't mean instant peace and stability. Nope, the 19th century added a whole new layer of conflict, as the young republic really struggled to figure out who it was and defend its borders. It was just an era marked by one devastating war after another. I mean, the new nation was almost immediately thrown into conflict. An attempt to unite with Bolivia was defeated. Spain made one last-ditch effort to get back in the game, which failed. But the really devastating one was the War of the Pacific against Chile. Peru lost its southern provinces, which were packed with valuable resources. That defeat was a deep national trauma that led to a long, painful period they called national reconstruction. And that brings us to our final, and maybe our most complicated, layer. We're going to look now at the dramatic political and economic roller coaster of the 20th and 21st centuries, which is still shaping Peru right now. The late 1980s were a time of absolute crisis. The country was being torn apart by a violent internal conflict, and the economy was in freefall from just staggering hyperinflation. I mean, look at that number. A cumulative inflation of 2.2 million%. It's almost impossible to even wrap your head around. And that total economic collapse is what set the stage for a radical political shift. That shift came with an outsider named Alberto Fujimori. His decade in power remains incredibly polarizing in Peru. On one side, his harsh Fuji-shock policies did manage to tame hyperinflation, and his government defeated the Shining Path insurgency. But on the other side, he dissolved Congress in a self-coup, and his presidency was stained by severe human rights abuses and ended in a massive corruption scandal. Since the year 2000, Peru's had a lot of economic growth, but politically, it's just been chronically unstable. This timeline is wild. It's a revolving door of presidents getting impeached, resigning, or being removed from office. In one chaotic week in 2020, the country had 3 different leaders. It's this deep political turmoil that continues to be one of the nation's biggest challenges. And that brings us right up to today. When you look at Peru, you're really seeing all of these layers at once. The deep indigenous roots, the legacy of empire, the scars of colonialism, the struggles of a young republic, and the turbulence of modern politics. They're all still there, shaping every single challenge and every opportunity. So it leaves you with this big question. After all of that, what does Peru's next layer look like? If you found this deep dive into history insightful, you should definitely check out the other explainers in our Quick Country Histories playlist. And of course, make sure you subscribe to Notebook Summaries so you don't miss what's coming next.